I rescued the abandoned puppy but found out it's not a dog. Jack hadn't spoken a full sentence to another soul in over 16 months, unless you counted the low mutters he made to the wind or the half conversations he carried on with the crackling fire. Since the accident, since that frozen morning, when the world stole his daughter and gave nothing back, his voice had become a thing of memory, like the warmth of her fingers, the sound of her laughter echoing through pines. Now, the only heartbeat he heard was his own, and sometimes, just sometimes, he wasn't even sure about that. The Montana wilderness had a way of quieting the noise in a man's soul until even the silence began to press against your ribs like a second skin. That's why, when the scratching came at the door that night, it didn't feel like interruption. It felt like awakening. He had noticed things all day, birds circling without call, the snow drifting sideways, though no wind stirred, and those tracks, God, those tracks. He'd stood at the window for almost an hour, watching the trail snake around his cabin, massive paws like wolves but marked with feline arcs. Too deliberate, too knowing. He told himself it was nothing. He lied. But when the scratching came, light but persistent, he didn't hesitate. His boots crunched against the wooden floor as he crossed the room, the rifle still leaning against the wall untouched. He opened the door, and there she stood, thin to the bone, ribs visible beneath fur once thick and golden. Now darkened by snow and ash, she didn't move. Her eyes, amber in the porch light, locked onto his with something deeper than desperation. Between her front legs, two small forms shivered, pressed against her like she could shield them from the entire world. And somehow, in that moment, Jack felt the weight in his chest loosen, not vanish, but shift. He opened the door wider and stepped aside. She limped in, silent, dignified, her eyes never leaving his. He closed the door, stoked the fire, and brought a towel to dry her fur. She didn't growl, she didn't flinch. She simply lay there, as though she had made a choice, as though she had known he would say yes. When he lifted one of the pups, a round-eyed, wide-pawed thing no bigger than a loaf of bread, he noticed its odd silence. It didn't yelp or squirm. It blinked slowly, tilting its head as if measuring him. He set it gently by the hearth and did the same for the other. Then he returned to the mother. That's when he saw the wound. It slashed diagonally across her belly, not clean like a blade, not jagged like a branch, something in between. But what froze him wasn't the cut. It was the faint green glow that pulsed along its edges, like bioluminescence underwater. He wrapped her with clean cloth, his hands steady, his heart anything but. Grace, he whispered, not sure why, but the name felt right. The next few days unfolded like a dream Jack didn't dare wake from. Grace didn't bark or whimper. She watched. Always watched. The pups, still unnamed, stayed near the fireplace, almost never moving unless he did. He fed them venison, rabbit, even dog food he hadn't used in years. They sniffed it, circled it, and then stepped away. Not a bite taken. He tried milk, broth, even boiled rice. Nothing. And yet, they didn't grow weaker. If anything, they seemed stronger every sunrise. One night, Jack awoke to a noise not loud, but deep, a humming. He sat up in his armchair, eyes scanning the room. Grace stood in the center, head tilted back, mouth closed. But the sound came from her, a low, pulsing vibration that shook the window panes and made the flame in the hearth flicker blue. When she opened her eyes, Jack staggered back, no longer soft amber, now molten gold, like twin suns buried beneath ice. Then the sound stopped. Grace lowered her head and lay down beside the pups. Jack didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The following morning, he drove to town, his first trip in weeks. Doc Maynard listened patiently, examined Grace without a word, and then pulled Jack aside. "This dog's not normal," he said. "Her structure is wrong. I've seen wolves, hybrids, but this..." He held up an x-ray. Jack blinked. Fine metallic strands lined Grace's spine, woven like roots of a tree. "She's engineered?" Jack asked. The vet didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. Jack took them home. That night, he dreamed of Emily, not the girl he lost, but older, standing by the edge of the trees. "You remember, Mom?" Her breath visible, her eyes unreadable. She said nothing, just pointed toward the cabin. When he turned, he saw flames inside the firelight. Those golden eyes stared back at him through the window. When he awoke, all three creatures sat perfectly still, watching him. That day, one of the pups scaled the bookshelf to the ceiling. Another vanished into the woods, and returned with a dead squirrel clean kill. No blood, eyes closed like it had died of peace. Jack said nothing, just stared. Then came the knock. Not at the front door, but the back, the one no one used, the one that opened to nothing but trees. 3 men in black coats. No badges, no greetings, just a sentence. "We understand you have something that belongs to us." Jack didn't answer. The tallest one continued. "The mother was part of a containment breach. We're here to secure the offspring." "They're not specimens," Jack said. "They're living, which is exactly why we're interested." Then the fight. It wasn't long. Jack struggled, was thrown, fell into a trap he'd forgotten he'd set years ago. His legs snapped. Pain shot through his body. He screamed, but Grace moved before they could. She lunged not with rage, but purpose. She struck the man closest to Jack, sending him sprawling into the snow. Then she turned, nudged Jack free of the trap, and in doing so, stepped into it herself. The metal jaws clamped down. She didn't cry out. She looked at Jack with the same expression Emily once had when she knew he was leaving for another shift: acceptance. "Love. Goodbye." Jack crawled to her, held her, felt her breath slow. One of the men called for backup, but it was too late. Grace's last breath came not as a gasp, but a hum, the same warm vibration. Then silence. Jack buried her beneath the pine tree, the one Emily planted when she was 5. He marked it with a stone. No name, just a carved flame. Then he went inside, and he began to write. The online post went live at 2:13 a.m. Typed with trembling hands and eyes red from grief but burning with purpose. And Jack didn't expect anyone to read it. Not really, because who still cared about a lonely man ranting about glowing-eyed dogs and strangers in the woods? But by sunrise, the screen was blinking with messages. Notifications piling up like falling snow. People from cities and coasts and countries Jack had never stepped foot in were sharing his words. Drawn not to the scientific impossibility, but to the quiet heartbreak threaded between the lines. The image of a mother sacrificing herself in silence, and a man who had already lost too much now losing again. And somehow, despite his reluctance, the story of Grace caught fire across the digital world. Her image golden, scarred, proud, rendered in sketches. Digital paintings, even children's crayon drawings sent from a school in Oregon. And while Jack didn't answer most messages, he read them all. Every desperate plea from parents who'd lost children, veterans who'd lost comrades, people who just wanted to believe that something pure still walked among the rot of the modern world. And slowly, the cabin didn't feel as far away from the world anymore, because the world was leaning in to listen. He kept Grace's 2 offspring close. The one with sharper eyes and longer limbs he called Ash. The other, smaller but more perceptive, he named Wren. And they grew fast, too fast, changing by the week. Their fur darkening, their eyes deepening to shades he couldn't name. And though they never barked, they communicated with each other in strange pulses, soft thuds against the floorboards, flicks of their tails, vibrations in the walls that Jack could feel in his ribs. And he began to dream differently. Less of fire and ice and more of places he'd never been. Standing stones in moonlight, tunnels lined with roots that breathed. And always, always, the sense of being watched not with malice, but with expectation. Then came the morning when the woods stood too still. Not a single bird call, not a breeze to move the trees. And Jack knew something was wrong before he opened the door and found the first symbol, a spiral carved into the snow with precision no human hand could replicate. Each line exactly equidistant, melting slightly at the edges as if drawn by heat, and Ash stood beside it. Not growling, not afraid, just alert. And when Jack reached to touch the spiral, Ash placed a paw gently on his arm, halting him. That night, the dream sharpened. He saw Grace again, but not as she'd been in death, rather standing tall, uninjured, eyes like gold moons, standing at the edge of the forest beside a tree Jack didn't recognize, bark black as coal and leaves that whispered in languages he didn't understand. And she opened her mouth to speak, but only a hum came out, low and rumbling, shaking him from sleep and sweat and tears. And when he sat up, Wren was sitting at the foot of his bed, watching, not blinking, as if she had seen the same thing the next day. While chopping wood near the shed, Jack heard the crunch of footsteps, not his own 3 sets, deliberate, and when he turned, there were men again, but not the same as before. These were dressed differently, less official, more feral, beards too long, eyes too pale, And one of them smiled without lips and said, "She was never yours to keep." And Jack didn't speak, didn't move, just stared as Wren and Ash appeared beside him. One on each side, and the air around them thickened like honey, time dragging slow, and something in the expressions of the men changed, not fear exactly, but recognition, like they had touched something sacred and realized too late that their hands were unclean. And they backed away, not a word spoken, disappearing between the trees like ghosts. That evening, Jack found the second symbol beneath the porch, an eye made of pine cones, perfectly symmetrical, a line of ash trailing from the center. And he didn't sleep that night. The following week, news broke online of an incident at a private research facility 300 miles east, containment breach. 4 dead. No animals recovered, and while officials called it a tragedy of human error, some commenters whispered of things with eyes that lit up the dark and moved without sound. And Jack knew somehow that the facility had once housed Grace, or something like her, and that others were searching now, not just for science, but for power, for the kind of living secrets that rewrote the rules of nature. When the storms returned, thicker and colder than expected, Jack fortified the cabin, not out of fear, but readiness, because the spiral had appeared again, this time in the frost on the windows. Etched from the inside, ash had begun to vanish for hours, returning with bits of strange things, shards of black stone warm to the touch, feathers that shimmered like oil, and once, a smooth bone carved with runes that changed shape when you looked away. Jack kept them in a box under the floorboards, unsure if he was collecting or protecting. And then the dream came that was not a dream. He woke to the scent of burning pine and walked barefoot out into the snow, drawn by a glow that hovered just beyond the trees. And there, in a clearing he had never seen before, stood a structure, circular, ancient, pulsing with light from beneath the earth. And in the center, a figure stood tall, not Grace but familiar, with eyes like forged brass and fur that moved like flame in windless air. And though her mouth didn't move, he heard the words in his chest, "You are the hinge, not the door." And then he woke, frost on his eyelashes, feet clean, no prints in the snow. But the pine tree outside bore a fresh marking, a third symbol, 3 vertical lines crossed by 1 horizontal. Bleeding sap. Jack didn't tell the internet about that one, didn't photograph it, just stared until the sun melted it away. And when night fell, he locked the cabin for the first time in weeks, not out of fear, but reverence, because he now understood that whatever had begun with Grace was still unfolding. And the forest wasn't just alive, it was watching, waiting, remembering. Jack stopped counting days because the forest no longer followed them, not in the way humans did, with clocks and calendars and ticking reminders of mortality, but with shifts in breath and pressure and the way the moss changed color near the creek. And while the world outside raged with questions, comment sections turning theories into wildfire, some claiming cryptids, others calling him a hoax artist, or worse, inside the cabin, time swirled quietly like smoke from the fire. And the only thing that grew louder was the rhythm, the pulse beneath the floorboards that Jack once thought was just his own grief echoing, but now realized was something deeper, older, and alive. Ash and Wren had changed again, not just in body, but in presence. Ash's limbs now long and sinewy like a shadow-given flesh, with shoulders that moved like liquid steel and a stare that no longer blinked in curiosity but in recognition. While Wren had developed a stillness that unnerved Jack more than any growl, for she could sit unmoving for hours, eyes trained on a blank spot in the wall as if watching a world Jack couldn't see. And when she finally did move, it was with uncanny grace, like stepping between seconds. He noticed they no longer touched food or water in his presence. And though their bodies grew leaner, they did not weaken. Instead, they shimmered faintly when the sun hit them just right, as though the light itself refracted differently around their forms. The symbols returned, not just in the snow, but in frost patterns on the windows, in the cracks of old wood, in the swirling of his coffee when he stirred it. And Jack began sketching them in a notebook, obsessively copying every spiral, line, and rune, unable to shake the feeling that they were not warnings, but instructions. Then one morning, the cabin fell silent, not peacefully, but like a held breath, and Ash stood by the window, tail low, ears back, emitting a low rumble that Jack felt more in his bones than heard. And when he looked out, he saw the man alone, tall, wrapped in a parka too clean for this wilderness, standing at the edge of the trees like he didn't belong in any world. and Jack opened the door without thinking, because somehow he knew this wasn't another soldier or researcher, but something else entirely. The man introduced himself with a name Jack forgot the moment it was spoken. But the voice stayed, smooth like water over stone, and he said only this: "She is waking," and then turned and walked into the woods without waiting for acknowledgement. And Jack didn't follow, not because he didn't want to, but because his legs wouldn't move, locked by something in that man's stare that told him to wait. That night, Jack dreamt of a hallway made of tree roots, endless and alive, and at the far end was a door made of bone and breath, pulsing gently, and from behind it came a heartbeat, steady and enormous. And he reached for the handle but awoke just as his fingers touched it, gasping, drenched in sweat. And the fire was out, though he didn't remember it dying. Wren was sitting at the foot of his bed again, her eyes no longer just amber, but glowing faintly blue. And Jack realized then that she wasn't a pet, not a companion, but a sentinel, and he was the one being watched. Messages online grew stranger, people claiming sightings of similar creatures in other forests, hushed government evacuations near wildlife preserves, stories of glowing eyes and vanishing tracks, and some wrote to Jack asking him to name them, to give the beings an identity. But Jack refused, because naming something was a kind of claiming, and nothing about Grace or her kin belonged to anyone anymore. Then came the fourth, marking an intricate knot of lines carved directly into the door of his cabin. Not by claw or blade, but as if the wood had grown it from within. And when Jack touched it, a sharp jolt ran up his arm, and for a moment he wasn't in Montana but somewhere vast and dark, where trees stretched into the clouds, and the sky was not sky but moving shadow. And in that place he heard her again, not Grace but the source of grace, the voice that hummed inside the heartbeat he felt now in the walls of the cabin. And it said only, "Protect the breath." And when he blinked, he was back in his chair, Wren now at his side, staring at the carving with solemn reverence. Days passed, or what Jack thought were days, and the cold deepened. Not just in weather, but in presence. Like the forest was drawing inward, bracing for something, and animals disappeared from the area entirely. No deer prints, no bird song, not even the chatter of squirrels. Just silence and the occasional thrum from the earth that Jack could now feel with his feet. And one evening Ash returned with blood on his fur, not animal, but thicker, darker, humming with something wrong, and Jack didn't ask what it was from because he already knew there were others out there, still searching, still hunting for what they believed could be caged and understood. The next morning, Jack found a device buried in the snow near his woodshed, blinking red, shielded in camouflage netting surveillance. Military grade, and he dismantled it in silence, burned the pieces, then checked the perimeter for others. He dug traps from the snowbanks, camouflaged his footprints, and when the next storm came, he stayed awake through the night, the shotgun loaded but untouched, because he knew that metal wouldn't protect what needed guarding. Wren slept near the hearth, Ash vanished for longer and longer stretches, and the dreams became clearer, the bone door reappearing each time with new symbols etched into its surface, always more detailed, more desperate, as if urging him to open it, to step through. But he never did, not yet. Then, during one of the coldest nights of the season, when the moon was a slit of silver and the world held its breath, Jack awoke to a sound unlike any he'd heard before. Not a howl, not a scream, but a note, singular and high, like the forest itself singing. And he followed it outside in his boots and coat, snow up to his calves. And there, in the same clearing where he first met Grace, stood a shape taller than a moose, with fur that shimmered silver black, its eyes not just glowing but reflecting stars that didn't belong to the sky. And beside it stood Ash and Wren, now unrecognizable as mere animals, their forms elongated, abstract, pulsing with light from within. And Jack didn't speak, didn't breathe, just watched as the large creature stepped forward and lowered its head to his. And in the silence that followed, a memory surfaced, not his, but one ancient and collective, of a forest untouched, of beings that hummed with creation, and of mankind walking away from something sacred and losing the language to return. The being looked into Jack and saw everything, then turned and vanished into the trees with Ash and Wren behind it. Not fleeing, not hiding, but moving with purpose. And Jack stood alone, not afraid but cracked open, the cold forgotten, because he now knew what the symbols meant, what the breath was, and what must be protected next, not just creatures or places, but memory itself, the kind that can't be written, only felt, only guarded in silence until the world remembers how to listen again. Winter deepened into something more than weather, something with weight and intention. The kind of cold that settled into bones, not just from the outside in, but from the soul outward. And Jack no longer measured time in days or weeks, but in silences between the movements of the forest, in how long the hearth stayed warm without him feeding it, in how many times he awoke from dreams of a door of bone and breath to find the markings growing more complex, crawling up the cabin walls like vines of frost or veins of memory. And though Ash and Wren were no longer with him physically, at least not in a way that could be traced by footsteps or warmth, they were never absent, because their presence lived now in the land itself, in the pulse beneath the frozen creek that beat in sync with his own heart, in the distant shimmer between pine trunks that sometimes blinked like watching eyes, in the way the fire sometimes flared for no reason when he whispered their names. The world had not forgotten about Jack entirely, though it tried, because his story had spread farther than he ever meant it to. First as a curiosity, then as a symbol, then as something more dangerous, an idea that couldn't be controlled. And that made people nervous, especially those who wore suits and carried credentials with missing agency names and too wide smiles. The kind who arrived at the edge of his driveway one morning in a black SUV coated in dustless paint, stepping out in pairs, calm, polite, dangerous, asking questions he didn't answer. Like, are you still in contact with the subjects, and would you be willing to allow us access to your property for a non-invasive survey? And do you understand the national security implications of biological anomalies in an uncontrolled environment? To which Jack responded only by standing silently on his porch with a mug of black coffee in hand, shotgun visibly leaning against the doorway. Not as a threat, but as a language they understood, and eventually, they left. But not before planning something he couldn't see. Because that night, the firewood stack was moved slightly. The third stair on the porch creaked differently, and the owls didn't call until exactly 3:13 a.m. Oh, and when they did, it was the same rhythm Grace used to hum when her pups curled beside her, a sequence of sound that didn't belong to birds. The next day, Jack dug up the device he knew would be there, buried beneath the roots of the pine tree, where Grace rested, a sleek metallic disc no bigger than a hand mirror, humming faintly when touched, warm even in the snow. And when he held it up to the cabin's reflection, it did not show wood and shingles, but a structure beneath, something ancient and vast, mapped in lines of light and pulse. And Jack dropped it, stomped it twice, then burned the pieces with salt and cedar, just in case. That night he wrote in his journal, not online, not public, just for himself, a record of the changing symbols, of the dreams that now came not just during sleep, but when he blinked too long, when he looked into the fire and saw not flames but pathways, roots, stars bending inward, and always the door, closer now, the breath behind it heavier, almost audible, almost real. And then came the call, not through phone or radio, but through the trees, a low hum that vibrated in the marrow, that made the icicles tremble without wind. That called to something old in him, something deeper than memory, and Jack knew it was time to go, to leave the cabin, not in fear but in faith, to follow the trail that had no footprints but was unmistakable. And he packed lightly, only a flask of melted snow, his daughter's coat, and the sketchbook of symbols. And when he locked the door, he whispered thank you not to the house but to the presence that had lived within it, the one that kept him warm even before he noticed. The forest welcomed him like breath drawn in reverse, trees parting slightly as if remembering his shape. And he walked not with hesitation but reverence, because he was not going into the unknown, he was returning to it, to the clearing where Grace first appeared, though it no longer looked like it did before, the snow there untouched, glowing faintly from beneath as if lit by a memory instead of the sun. And in the center stood the door, not metaphor, not dream, but real now, constructed of twisted roots in bone-colored stone, humming with every beat of his heart. And as he approached, the air thickened with warmth despite the snow, a hush falling over the world as if everything had paused to witness. And then he heard her Grace, not in words, but in presence, in scent, in that soft vibrating hum that once calmed her pups and now calmed him. And the door pulsed once, twice, then opened inward, not into a room but into forest again, older, deeper, more alive, and Jack stepped through without looking back. Inside was light, not bright, but radiant, pulsing with soft rhythm, like the interior of a breathing animal. And he saw them, Ash and Wren, standing not as animals now, but as something else. Taller, more elongated, their fur woven with strands of moss and starlight. And behind them others, not many, but enough to know Grace had not been alone, had never been a mistake. And as he approached, Ash stepped aside to reveal a pool ball black as night, but glowing from within. And Jack understood without being told that this was the breath, the source, the thing the world forgot how to hear. And as he knelt beside it, the surface rippled and showed him images his daughter, not as he last saw her, but older, standing beneath that same black-leaved tree from the dreams, smiling and then fading, replaced by Grace, then by Wren, then by a shape too vast to define. And he wept not from sadness but from understanding, from the weight lifting at last. And when he looked up, Ash was gone, but the forest remained, and the breath remained, and Jack knew he would not return the same. Because now he carried something, a piece of that rhythm, a guardian of the silent language. And as he walked back through the door, the cabin was still there, smaller now, warmer somehow, and he entered, placed the sketchbook on the table, and whispered his daughter's name, not as goodbye, but as offering. And the fire flared blue for just a moment, then settled. And outside, the snow continued to fall in spirals that matched the symbols on the glass. It began with the wind again, not the kind that howled or chilled, but the kind that spoke soft and circular, rising from the earth rather than falling from the sky, curling through pine branches and under the eaves of the cabin like a breath returning home. And Jack, older now, though his body had not aged the way time would normally insist, stood in the doorway not with fear or even readiness, but with quiet knowing, for the world had shifted in ways others he might never see. But he felt it in the rhythm of his bones, in the way the frost formed only on the east windows, in how the birds had begun to sing before dawn again. And he knew the final chapter of Grace's legacy was not written in loss or defiance or even science, but in something simpler, older, circular, like the path of the snowflakes now falling outside in patterns too perfect to be random. Years had passed since the night of the door, or perhaps no time at all, because Jack had stopped counting when he realized the forest counted for him, marking days not by numbers, but by blooming stones and shifting constellations. And though no strangers had returned, not in black coats, not with clipped voices and veiled threats, Jack remained vigilant, not out of fear but duty, the kind passed from one guardian to another. And Wren, now the size of a small elk but moving with the silence of a falling leaf, came only at dusk, standing in the tree line like a statue of breath and intention, eyes still glowing that ancient blue that did not reflect the world but showed what lay beneath it. Ash had not returned since the door, but Jack felt him always, in the vibration beneath the soil, in the dreams that now came not as messages but as meetings, sitting with Grace under silver trees, his daughter joining them sometimes, her laughter no longer a memory but a presence, like heat you can't see but always feel. And the forest itself seemed to grow around these stories, shaping trails to protect them, letting only those who listened step forward. Jack had become something of a legend, not by intention, but because people needed myths when science failed them. And though he never confirmed or denied the wild tales that filtered through forums and whispered podcasts of man guardians and luminous wolves and forests that hum, he knew their purpose was not accuracy but hope. And so he let them spread, watering the seeds of reverence in a world starved for it. One day in late spring, when snow still clung stubbornly to the roots, but flowers had already begun blooming on the branches, a letter arrived, not electronic, not mailed, but left gently on the doorstep, tucked beneath a polished stone carved with the first symbol he had ever seen, the spiral, precise and unmistakable. And when Jack unfolded the parchment, the handwriting surprised him not because it was familiar, but because it was not handwriting at all, but impressions, as if the message had formed itself into the paper. It is time. And Jack nodded as if someone had spoken it aloud, folded the paper, placed it in the fire, and packed a small satchel water, a slice of dried meat, the sketchbook of symbols, and his daughter's coat. Always her coat, and as he stepped outside, he noticed the snow no longer fell down but up, rising gently from the ground like mist reversing, and every tree bowed slightly as he passed, not metaphorically but visibly, leaves trembling in acknowledgement. and though the sky was overcast, the light was soft, warm, golden in a way that spoke of endings, not as loss, but as arrival. The trail led him not toward the clearing of the door, but deeper still, to a place he had once avoided, where the mountain split into two cliffs, and in the crevice between them, something shimmered not visibly, but like a scent you remember from childhood, something sweet and distant. And when he stepped into the shadow between the cliffs, time folded, not in jolts or visions, but in fluidity. And suddenly he was in the moment before the first snowstorm, years ago, standing beside the version of himself that had just opened the door for grace. And he watched not to change anything, but to remember completely, to witness the full breath of the beginning. And as Grace limped into the cabin that first time, their eyes met again, across time, across understanding. And she nodded not with her head, but with her soul, and Jack felt something inside him unlock. A door within a door, and the path beneath him glowed with soft green light, guiding him forward, not outward, but downward, into the roots of the mountain. He descended not with feet, but with thought. The tunnel lined with memories, not his own images of creatures in lab cages, of scientists arguing, of Grace escaping through a vent too small for anything else, carrying her unborn pups inside her, her body already changing, adapting, choosing not survival, but legacy. And Jack realized then that she had not stumbled upon him by accident, but by intention, guided not by desperation, but instinct, the kind that remembers lifetimes past, and that his pain, his loss, his silence had made him the perfect sanctuary. Not because he was strong, but because he was broken open enough to listen. The tunnel ended in a chamber that pulsed like a heart, warm, damp, filled with light that had no source. And in the center stood the tree, the one from his dreams, bark black and glistening, leaves shifting colors like emotion. And beneath it lay the pool, not water, not light, but memory itself, and standing beside it was Wren, now taller than Jack, fur glistening with dew and shadow. And she turned to him, not in greeting but in offering. And beside her stood Ash, unchanged but eternal, his gaze calm and infinite. And Jack stepped between them and knelt by the pool, placing the sketchbook into it gently, watching as the pages dissolved not into fragments, but into music, notes rising from the surface in spirals, joining the breath of the chamber, and the tree above him shuddered, shedding a single leaf that landed in his palm. And the moment he touched it, he remembered everything, not just his story, but Grace's, the forest's, the breath of the first fire, the sorrow of every forgotten creature, and the quiet joy of their return. And in that space, Jack was no longer Jack, but a vessel of memory, a guardian of thresholds. And as the chamber pulsed once more, he lay down by the pool, placing the coat beside him like a flag of peace, and closed his eyes, not in death but in completion. And outside, the snow stopped falling, and the spiral carved into the frost on the cabin window faded gently, leaving only glass and silence, and the faintest echo of a heartbeat that was not human but deeply, eternally alive.